Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really going to dig into a recent geopolitical analysis, and it might just completely reframe how you're thinking about a major conflict. Get ready for this. It's a pretty bold statement, pulled straight from our source. Israel's war with Iran comes as no surprise. Its eventual war with Jordan shouldn't come as a surprise either. However, it has always been about Palestine.
That's a powerful way to start. It really sets the stage for what we're unpacking today. We're looking at a very recent and complex perspective, one that definitely challenges some common assumptions. Our source is an article. It's titled "Israel's War with Iran is About Palestine, Little Else." It was written by Iti Epstein, published just June 19th, 2025, so very current.
Right. And our mission here is pretty clear. We're going to break down the core argument of this piece, look at the evidence, the analysis it uses, and try to understand these, well, surprising connections it draws. We'll guide you through the author's viewpoint.
Exactly. And it's really important to stress that our goal is to explore the insights and arguments in this specific source. We're not here to endorse any particular view. Obviously, it's a sensitive topic.
Sure.
So we're focused on helping you grasp the author's thesis, the information they present.
Okay, so let's dive right into that central claim, the provocative one. The article asserts that Israel's recent war with Iran, and maybe even, future conflicts with Jordan, they're fundamentally about Palestine. So what's the foundation? What evidence does the author start with to build this case?
Well, it really kicks off with something called the Nagel Commission Report.
Yeah.
This was presented to Prime Minister Netanyahu back in early January of this year, 2025. This commission, it was chaired by Professor Jacob Nagel, former national security advisor, and its task was specific: suggest a major overhaul of Israeli military power, basically push for a more proactive attack stance and a significantly bigger budget.
Okay, and this report, it identified specific threats for the next decade, didn't it? Laid them out in a certain way. What did they pinpoint as the most critical dangers?
Yeah, the commission worked on the assumption of two big threats. First, a nuclear Iran, that's number one, and second, what it called conflagration, basically widespread conflict across the West Bank, Lebanon, Gaza, Syria, and Jordan. And what's really interesting, as you said, is the order. Iran first, then the others.
And what's striking is how the Commission seems to think some of those regional threats are, well, addressed since October 7th, but others are still critical. How does the report make that distinction?
Well, the report, it notes that threats in Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon have, in its view anyway, been addressed since that time. But it still flags the West Bank, which it calls Judea and Samaria and Jordan, as critical threats that are ongoing. And the reason it gives: the settlements. The presence of settlements, which the Commission argues, means Israel needs a bigger military footprint territorially in those areas. So for the author of our source material, this immediately ties the whole strategy back to the Palestinian question.
Okay, right. So if the West Bank and Jordan are seen as these critical threats linked to settlements, how does the Commission's strategy tackle Iran within that same picture?
The recommendation for Iran is remarkably stark. The quote is, to be eliminated as soon as possible at any cost and by any means, direct or indirect.
Hmm.
So we're not talking containment here, it's elimination.
At any cost. Wow. That's incredibly strong wording. What kind of capacity does the report say Israel needs to actually achieve something like that?
Well, to deal with these threats, Iran and the others, the report concludes, Israel has to significantly boost its capacity for a massive and sustained attack on Iran. And here's the key link, the core of the article's argument. This huge strike capability needs to be developed while Israel can simultaneously conduct hostilities in the West Bank and along that Israeli-Jordanian frontier. And, a lot of that frontier is actually within the occupied West Bank itself.
And this isn't just talk, right? The article suggests this strategy is already kind of being put into action on the ground.
It seems so. The report actually proposed forming a new Eastern Border Division, 25,000 soldiers, and the author points out that media reports are already showing a troop buildup along that eastern front, which leads the author to suggest Jordan could be the next nation to be subjected to the wanton use of force.
So we're seeing this intensification already in parts of the West Bank. Can you elaborate a bit on what the author observed there?
Yeah, the source highlights that since Israel attacked Iran, its forces have really ramped up operations across Nablus and Jenin governorates, that's in the northern West Bank. They've tightened movement restrictions, caused widespread damage, and there are ongoing mass demolitions, part of operations in Tulkarm, Nur Shams, and the Jenin refugee camp. This looks like those simultaneous hostilities the Commission report was talking about.
Hmm. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to international relations. How did the Nagel Commission see Israel's position with its allies, its global support?
Well, back in January, the Commission observed that the U.S. is Israel's one irreplaceable ally. That's pretty clear. But it also raised a big concern that Europe, and they specifically mentioned owing to Muslim immigration, might become more hostile to Israel in the future.
And that leads them to a pretty stark conclusion about how Israel needs to operate globally, doesn't it?
It really does. The Commission concluded that ultimately, international support for Israel depends on its ability to beat its enemies on its own. And this viewpoint directly feeds into its recommendations for a major push towards military self-reliance.
Which means becoming independent in terms of military supplies, right?
Exactly. They were concerned about recent arms embargoes some countries imposed on Israel. So the Commission recommended a shift towards critical munition independence for ground and air attacks. That includes local production of raw materials, which is a huge undertaking. It would need a 20% hike in military R&D budgets for the next 10 years, plus other funding. And he also notes this increase has been approved and even topped up since then. It's a strategic move, really, to avoid being dependent on anyone else.
So all these recommendations, the proactive stance, self-reliance, what does this add up to in terms of the basic philosophy of using force, according to the Nagel Commission?
The Commission's bottom line is that Israel shouldn't just contain threats anymore. Instead, it needs to adopt a preemptive, active approach. The direct quote is quite revealing. Deliberately going to war at the right moment is essential for the future of the state. That's a pretty significant redefinition of national security thinking, prioritizing preemption way over containment.
That sounds like a fundamental shift away from traditional defensive ideas, basically arguing for offensive war. But the author of our source, Iti Epstein, he pushes back hard on the legality of this, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He argues very forcefully that this deliberate decision to attack Iran just cannot be justified as preventive self-defense. He says that concept, preventive self-defense, actually has no legal basis under international law. And he points directly to Article 2.3 of the UN Charter, which is fundamental. It says all nations must settle disputes peacefully.
And he also brings in a UN General Assembly resolution to back that up.
Yes, he references UN General Assembly Resolution 3314 from back in 1974. It's a key text defining aggression. The author suggests that under this resolution, Israel using force in that kind of preemptive way would be considered prima facie evidence of an act of aggression.
Wow. And adding to that, the Nagel Commission apparently recommends a very specific level of force, one that seems to, well, clash with established international norms.
It does. The Commission concluded Israel's use of force should be as disproportionate as possible and continuously unrelenting. The goal, annihilation or debilitation of its enemies. That kind of language, as disproportionate as possible, is highly unusual, even in military strategy discussions. It often signals something beyond typical military aims.
And again, the author puts this right up against core principles of international law, especially the laws governing how wars are fought.
Precisely. He points to another UN resolution, General Assembly Resolution 2675 from 1970, that one established that civilian populations or individual members thereof should not be the object of reprisals. The author argues that both Israel and Iran are now pushing back against a long-term trend trying to outlaw reprisals, which goes beyond what the Geneva Conventions already prohibit. It really raises serious questions about whether these fundamental principles are being eroded.
He also connects this to the situation in Gaza, doesn't he, in the context of disregarding international humanitarian law.
Yes, the author writes about almost 2 years of debilitating attacks on Gaza's civilians and public infrastructure, its homes, schools, and hospitals. He states that these were endorsed by Israeli officials and publics in criminal disregard of international humanitarian law. He argues this has made it much harder to protect civilians in the wider conflict now, setting a really dangerous precedent.
So it's not just about blaming one side, then. The author seems to be suggesting a broader attack on the whole structure of international law itself.
That's really the heart of his argument in this part. The author stresses that both Israel and Iran have a duty to follow jus in bello rules, the laws of war conduct. These rules ban unnecessary, indiscriminate, disproportionate, or reckless attacks. He argues that both jus contra bellum, the laws against starting aggressive wars, and jus in bello are under assault. And he also adds a reminder about the UN Security Council's role under Article 51 of the Charter. Its job is to restore peace and security, regardless of any self-defense claims. It's a pretty bleak assessment of where things stand with global governance.
With such a major report, it makes you wonder, who are the key influences behind the Nagel Commission? The author gives some interesting background on that.
Yeah, he notes that among the very few external briefers who actually appeared before the commission were Amir Ben Shavat, He's a former national security advisor, now chair of the Misgav think tank and also the Argument Institute. And the author describes both of these as offshoots of the right-wing Kohelet Policy Forum.
Okay, so the author isn't just laying out the report's findings. He's also offering a critical take on the motivations, linking them to a wider political project.
Exactly. He calls these groups bad faith actors and claims they're pushing Israel's constitutional overhaul. Just to clarify for listeners, this refers to those proposed laws aimed at weakening the judiciary, limiting the independence of judges and lawyers. The author argues this overhaul suddenly removed even the nominal legal protections that Palestinians under occupation previously had, however limited they were.
And this leads to a really provocative, kind of chilling claim about the real purpose behind this aggressive stance towards Iran.
It does. Ite Epstein writes, and this is a direct quote again, that the true purpose and object of Israel's war of aggression against Iran is regime change, not in Tehran, but in Tel Aviv.
Hmm.
He's arguing the ultimate aim is to lock in a permanent state of emergency, basically dismantle what he calls the little remaining vestiges of democracy inside Israel itself. That's a profound internal critique.
That's an incredibly serious charge. So how does the author link Prime Minister Netanyahu himself to this alleged goal?
Well, the author claims Netanyahu's rule, which he describes using terms like a web of emergency powers and a dysfunctional judiciary and legislature, is essentially looking for justifications far away, like 2,000 kilometers away in Iran. But, the author argues, the actual victims of this policy would end up being Palestinians much closer to home in the West Bank and Gaza. It suggests the foreign policy has deep domestic political roots.
So what does the article say is the actual endgame, then, in the occupied Palestinian territory, according to Mir Ben-Shabbat, one of those commission briefers?
Right, so Mir Ben-Shabbat, apparently 1 year after the October 2023 hostilities began, laid out Israel's endgame for Gaza. Permanent Israeli military and civil control. No Palestinian governance, not Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority, full stop. For the West Bank, a defeated Palestinian Authority, greatly expanded Israeli settlements, and basically entrenching annexation. So this detailed plan from Ben-Shabbat, according to the author, shows a long-term strategic vision that completely reshapes the future of these territories, going way beyond just managing the current conflicts.
Okay, so with all of that laid out, the commission, the legal arguments, the alleged endgame, what's the author's final conclusion? How does he think the world will eventually react to all this?
The author predicts it might take several months before world leaders really distance themselves from what he calls Israel's patent breach of international law. But he believes they eventually will. They'll realize, he writes, that it has always been about Palestine, not Iran's nuclear plan. That's his final word on it.
And just as a final stark thought from the source material itself, Cyprian Simchowitz, who's described as a jurist and international law expert, reacted to the article. Her comment was, "Israel's increasing arrogance and lawlessness must be stopped." So just to quickly recap the core argument from the article we've deep dived into today, it puts forward the idea that these current geopolitical tensions, these conflicts, from this specific viewpoint are fundamentally rooted in the long-standing issue of Palestine. It really challenges that conventional narrative, doesn't it, by drawing this direct line between the big regional strategies and what's happening day to day in the occupied territories.
Yeah, absolutely. And we really hope this exploration, based purely on the source material provided, has maybe shifted or at least deepened your understanding of some incredibly complex global conflicts right now.
Well,
Hopefully offering a perspective you maybe hadn't considered quite like this before.
so here's a final thought to leave you with, building on this analysis. If, as this author suggests, this incredibly complex web of conflicts in the Middle East really does funnel back ultimately to that foundational unresolved issue of Palestine, what does that imply? What are the implications for the future of international diplomacy, for the very idea of achieving peace in the region? Something to think about. We'll see you next time.